Hello and welcome to the breakout session on ageism, addressing ageism across the life course. My name's Thomas Sharp. I'm Professor of Social Gerontology at Newcastle University, and it's my pleasure to be able to chair this session. Ageism is often regarded as the last acceptable ism in society, and the experience of 2020 shows how deep-rooted ageism still is in many of our societies. We can see this in the US presidential election, in the global response to COVID-19, and in the language and images that are often used to represent later life. But ageism isn't only an issue for older people. Writing in the early 1990s, Bill Bythway and Julia Johnson suggested that ageism legitimates the use of chronological age to mark out classes of people who are systematically denied resources and opportunities that others enjoy, and who suffer the consequences of such denigration, ranging from well-meaning patronage to unambiguous vilification. So they deliberately omitted chronological age or older age as being part of a narrow definition. So it's entirely appropriate that today in this session we focus on addressing ageism not just in older age, but across age groups. And in the discussion, we'll be considering how people of different ages can come together to tackle ageism across the life course. So I'd like to encourage people listening in to use the Q&A function to post your questions to the panel. Our panel is made up of three excellent speakers. I'll introduce each in turn, but we have Louise Ansari from Centre for Aging Better, Tara McCloud from Age Remain, and Hannah McDowell from the Centre for Policy on Aging. And each panelist will be speaking for about 5 minutes before we then get into the discussion. So we're going to start with Louise Ansari, who leads the communications team at Centre for Aging Better. She has a background in health communications, social policy and local services. And Louise is going to speak to the topic, why language matters. Over to you, Louise.
Thank you, Tom, and it's great to be here today. So I'm just going to start off by building on your definition of ageism there, and people listening, people on the call will know probably that the word ageism was coined by Robert Butler, a gerontologist in the States in the 1960s, as bias from one age group towards another. So as you say, not solely experienced by older people. And the way the World Health Organization was starting to helpfully define the different aspects of ageism are a combination of the way we think about age, so stereotypes that come into play, how we feel about aging, so that's our prejudices, and then how we act with a potential for discrimination in our behaviours. And of course, ageism is not only about how we think and feel about others, it also impacts on how we feel about ourselves. And that can lead to self-limiting behaviours. So it can lead to people saying, I shouldn't be doing that at my age. So there are aspects of how we feel about others, but also how we feel about ourselves that can be extremely damaging. Now, there are lots of different aspects of ageism, and I think Tara and Hannah are going to deal with some broader ones than me. I'm just going to focus, as Tom said, on the project we've been working on, which is about the language used and the narratives used about ageing, which underpin the attitudes and the stereotypes that we see all around us. So, society's dominant narratives on ageing are profoundly negative, pretty much across the board. So you'll have a narrative about physical and cognitive decline, with older people being characterised as vulnerable and dependent as one homogenous group. And the idea that ageing society means that there are huge numbers of vulnerable people, which has a knock-on effect of being an economic burden on the rest of society. And then that can also translate into a feeling of intergenerational unfairness at best and conflict at worst. You will all know this, no doubt. So by 2040, 1 in 4 of us are going to be over 65, and 1 in 3 of us are going to be over 50. So that's huge numbers of the population. And do we want to live with these overwhelmingly negative and ageist attitudes? Of course we don't. So the Centre for Ageing Better, working with the University of Kent and Comres and equally ours, a market research company, we've explored the language used around ageing, particularly looking at media, marketing, advertising, charities, government, and the NHS. And we chose those institutions because they've all got a really significant role in reinforcing narratives and creating public policy around later life, and therefore influencing really deeply how we think and feel and act. So I'm going to very briefly take each of those. We've got the full report on our website. I really encourage you to read it and take briefly the kind of narratives that each of those use and how we think they should change. So in government, ageing is seen primarily as a cost of the public purse. Older people are often referred to in regard to social care, notwithstanding, of course, that people of all ages access social care. And the narrative is overwhelmingly fatalistic. It's about crisis. Often age is used as a proxy for wealth, ignoring the fact sometimes that there are about 1.9 million people 65 and over who live in relative poverty. So we think that fatalistic language needs to be avoided, that age shouldn't be used as a proxy for wealth, and that the diversity of later life needs to be recognised. And Tom mentioned COVID there. When you look at how older people have been characterised as just simply vulnerable and to be cared for, that actually goes against the fact that in terms of community activity, older people were often the ones doing the caring for and being out there. So there's a real deficit in that narrative that needs to change. Now, if you look at the media, very quickly they go to stereotypes, of course. In imagery as well as language, you're either lonely or abused, or you are a hero. And the broadsheets are, whilst they are more likely to talk about health and social care, annoyingly, they're also more likely to stoke intergenerational tension. So the kind of scrape of language, the discourse analysis that these companies did for us, found, for example, titles like "Baby Boomers and Millennials seem at constant loggerheads." And we know from other research that that just isn't true, that actually generations do deeply care about each other. If you look at social media, that's where the really nasty and insulting language comes in, which, you've got phrases like old hag, dirty old man, just and worse, all over social media. Some of it is sort of almost funny, with lots of phrases like "my nan could keep a clean sheet against Chelsea," and she's been dead 10 years. So there's quite a lot of those "my nan could" phrases, which is a joke. Probably not. The other thing about social media, though, which is a potential opportunity, is that because it is such an open space, a lot of older people are using it to have a real voice, be diverse, talk about themselves, and counteract those narratives. We think across media, the editor's code needs to include language as a protected characteristic in the same way that it does on race and gender. And social media should challenge hate speech where they see it. Now, in advertising, we found 3 types of narrative: a tragic one, of vulnerability; a glamorous one, where after people had used anti-aging products, so words like "turn back the clock." And the third type of adverts were directed at products like holiday products, finance, funeral, which were a bit more neutral, but tended to have a happy white and white-haired heterosexual couple as the image normally used. We think that the Advertising Standards Authority should set standards on age, and general products should be marketed to all ages, and stock photography should capture the diversity of later life, which it really doesn't at the moment. And then the final area of charities. Now, obviously, we're a charity and we want to learn from this work as well. And generally, we found very kind of caring, positive, supporting language. But in some of the charities, you have a dominating narrative of loneliness, with loneliness framed as something that was inevitable, no chance of preventing it, and ignoring that it's a state actually that is experienced by all ages, and in fact often more experienced by 16 to 24-year-olds. So there's a real tension there clearly with fundraising narratives and a bit more progressive framing. So we think charities generally should try and avoid those kind of stereotypes and emphasize the good as much as the bad. So to finish that kind of brief canter through the report, negative stereotypes and framing are absolutely pervasive across lots of sectors, and there's a lot of work to do to try and change this. We think it's absolutely damaging to the social fabric of Britain. And for a huge section of the population to be characterised in this negative way is plainly wrong. It makes us feel bad about ourselves as well as bad about other people. So we need to move towards a much more realistic and diverse narrative that looks at the opportunities as well as the challenges of later life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Louise. And I just reiterate that you can download the excellent report that has been recently published by Centre for Ageing Better by visiting their website, and I recommend that to everybody. We're going to move straight on now to Tara McCloud. Tara is founder and director of Age Remade, and she's an expert in marketing strategy, consumer insight, and behavior change. And Tara's theme is the last acceptable ism. Tara.
Thank you. Good afternoon. At Age Remade, what we try to do is we work with businesses to reframe older age as a time of opportunity. And the two questions I'm going to be answering this afternoon is, why does ageism still exist and why is it perpetuated? Slide. Did that work? Oh, good. So I really want to start with what is any ism? An ism is about judgment, it's about difference, it's about exclusion, but fundamentally it's about power of a dominant group keeping others out or others down. Slide. But ageism is a social construct. It does exist at many levels throughout the life course. However, it's not a particularly salient issue, and it operates at a low level and usually goes unchallenged. So for the old, the language is derogatory, diminishing, and non-aspirational, as Louise has just outlined. But for the young, it's often offensive characterizations, such as snowflake. But it's especially bad for older people due to the negative consequences. And I also think that media informs culture, and culture shapes attitudes and perceptions and behavior. So I looked at these questions through the lens of creative industries to see if they contributed to our perceptions of age by a small research project. In general, creative industries rely heavily on stereotype, but it's also seen as an industry where being young is better than being old. So youth is about energy, vitality, but it's also about the future, whereas old is about the end of life and terminal decline. But how does it work beyond that? Slide. So marketing and advertising communications reflect life. They do not create new views of life. And they also use a short form of communication. They only have seconds to make their point and make a sell. And they're not social enterprises driven by social good. They're commercial, and their imperative is to make money for both their clients and themselves. But importantly, they're also risk averse. They stick to what they know works. They do not want to create something potentially unrecognizable. And they also lack the experience of age. The average age as an agency is 31 years, and there are very few clients over 50. So moving on to long form communications, and by that I mean TV programs, plays, films, they actually can change the narrative, and thus attitudes if they can layer and develop character. But once again, they're not social enterprises, and they need to be able to see what they make will sell. And importantly, through my research, they just don't have the words to describe the benefits of old age. They said, we just don't know how to do it. And yet they can acknowledge that people over 50 have the money. They're reluctant to reorient because they fear they will put off a younger recruitment audience. Slide. So I thought it might be useful to look at how other issues have leveled up. So I looked at feminism, racism, and climate change, and they had a number of things in common. First, they were all led by activists. Someone got up and made a stand. Second, the issues, while perhaps not accepted, are now recognized as issues. And third, especially recently, there have been trigger events which fostered a reassessment. So we've had Black Lives Matter, we have Me Too, and we also had plastic and Greta Thunberg and David Attenborough. But they all share basically the same enemy, which is the male white patriarchy who don't want to change and want to protect their interests and power by keeping other groups down and out. Slide. But ageism is different. If lucky, everybody gets older. Men, women, whatever their creed, color, sexuality, etc. But now more than ever, healthily. But ageism in the main is not recognized as a big issue. And where is the fight and against whom? So a knee-jerk response would be it's young versus old, but as we all know, intergenerational warfare is not the answer. You can replace old stereotypes with new ones, but stereotypes are about extremes and not normalization, so equally unhelpful. But it could start by stopping using age as the barometer of competence and worth. So how is negativity being perpetuated? Slide. I think we're all complicit. I think we're driven by ingrained unconscious bias. So there's a need to move from unconscious bias through to a conscious recognition, which would be a really happy state where people of all ages were accepted for who they individually were. More importantly, I think we have to use our individual power to reject it. Just don't participate. Do not say when you forget something you're having a senior moment. Do not buy or accept birthday cards which portray old people as doddering, incompetent fools. Do not buy products that offend, and use your consumer power to make your voice heard. So, slide. So I think we have to start making the negativity against older people a recognized unacceptable behavior, which is difficult because if older people complain, they are playing straight into the negative stereotype of grumpiness. It'll also be hard because when placed against the other isms, it can be currently deemed as trivial by comparison. Currently, people are not embarrassed to be called ageist, unlike they are to be called sexist or racist. And I think this has to change because if it's not on people's agenda, they don't feel they need to address it. Slide. So how do we start to put it on people's agenda? Well, I think this group of age professionals need to enable others. We need to produce a clear framework for others to follow. I think importantly, we need to structurally recognize and name those 30 extra years of opportunity in healthy life, that 50 to 80 group, as a new life stage, because currently it's just homogenized into the category of old, which you become at 50. Slide. And if you want to take on a fight, there is one place to really start, and that's the fight for the right to work and be employed after 50. It will also reposition older workers as people of value. Slide. So for me, this is about reframing what older age is, which I see as a period of reinvention, opportunity, and development. It's about helping people in industry and society see the really changing picture. And ultimately, we all need to facilitate the change. And we need to do something and not just talk about it. Slide. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tara. That was really lovely. And I would very much like to come back to the discussion about reframing when we get into a debate after our next presentation. So I'm going to move straight on now to Hannah McDowell. Hannah is co-director of Worldwide International Global Solutions with the lovely acronym WIGS. She's an associate at the Centre for Policy on Aging as well. And Hannah's going to speak to the topic, Envisioning a Future of Aging for All. Over to you, Hannah.
Arun, can I just ask it for you to stop sharing your screen for me? Is that possible? I'll wait for that to happen, but I'll start anyway. So thank you. You've set me up so well, Louise and Tara. And I want to think about where this negative story of aging lives, where the sort of clammy corners, where does it set up shop? So I'm going to take this really personal, like this is on me, literally. So we start and we're born and we're asked, you know, what we're going to do when you grow up. Got your whole life ahead of you. World is your oyster. And then 40s to 50s, 55, you know, we start to go into this story of negative decline that we've already told. And then what we try and do is we mop up this mess here. A lot of what we're talking about now is how can we bring this line up so that the people here in the 50 plus aren't going to be reaping the consequences of this negative story. But the story starts here. It embeds in my early years. When I'm even 4 or 6, I've already got this into the caribou dust of my bones, this story. So I'm interested in what it would mean to scrap this story and find a new story of my very own aging, where I am in right relationship with all those different age identities I pass through in a full life. And I love how the tree ages. Starts laying down layers of identity, building the structure that's going to support all the identities that are to come. That's strong. It's a story of augmentation and not diminishment. Indeed, every single new layer embraces all the layers that have been before. And the wonderful paradox about how the tree does this is that at the one and the same time, the center point and the outside edge are both the oldest and the youngest point of the tree. You can't say to a tree, you're not getting any younger. It won't understand your comment. And I want intelligence like that, and I need it because, you know, when I come on the Zoom meeting before the rest of you have shown up, and I just sort of catch a little bit of an angle, you know, and I notice that this line here, it's quite a lot more than it used to be. You see, that's good, isn't it? And then this one, oh, it's not so bad, it's strange, it's sort of just gone one side. And then all I need to do is just sort of like think of frowning and then look at these bad boys, up they come, like this. And I see that, and some days I look at myself and I go, wow, you are a glorious human vessel through which life is flowing. And some days I don't, and I sort of like try and remember how it was when I was a little bit, and I find myself hoping it won't get worse. And on those days, I need this kind of intelligence, this sense of growth, augmentation, inclusion, and preparation for what is to come. And I need to learn it. And not just me, I'm 43. So I'm already sort of, you know, about here on this story, on the red story. So I probably do need that, right? But my niece, who is only 6, earlier in the summer, we're cycling along and she says, I don't want to turn 7. And I sort of talk about the pass the parcel, and I talk about the cake and the presents and the unicorns. She's like, no, I can get that other places. I don't want to turn 7 because my voice is going to change. And I like my voice how it is. At the age of 6, she is already struggling with this story. She's already noticing that her body's going to change and what will happen to her inner identity. And maybe both of us could take a leaf out of her younger brother's book, Micah, my nephew, who is 4. And we went to absolutely freezing Kew Gardens last week. And he said to me as he was sort of strutting his stuff in the winter cold, the reason I am so good at being a baddie leader is because I have been practicing for 8 years. I said, but Micah, you're only 4. I was practicing before I was born, he told me. And I thought, wow, that's a good attitude towards aging. That's the intelligence of the immortal jellyfish, that is. And I want me, and I want Zoe, and I want Micah to grow up not believing this story. I want them to grow up with a different story about their own aging. I want them to be able to be trees in a forest of trees of different ages and to feel good about it. And my concern is that when we spend a lot of time trying to mop up the mess here, good and important though that is, we miss the point that it starts here. And rather than getting a community of people who are in right relationship with their own aging and everyone else's, the risk is that we just get better and better anti-aging creams. So I've spoken very conceptually and somewhat creatively and metaphorically, but I've used up all my eyeliner. But I'm very happy to take much more sensible policy and practice type questions if you've got them.
It's fabulous. I'm sure if you write to ILC, they'll send you another supply of eyeliner to help you out in the future. That's fabulous. So thanks to Louise, Tara, Hannah for those thought-provoking presentations. And I think what we'll do now is we'll just move into the discussion. There's quite a lot to pick up there. And you know, I have my own backup questions just in case nobody came through on the Q&A, but fortunately people have been very diligent and have come up with some really nice questions that I think cut across the presentations really well. And I'm going to start, I'm going to actually start with a question from Ashton Applewhite here, because it does speak to the theme of the session in terms of ageism being the last acceptable ism. And she asked the question whether framing ageism as the last acceptable prejudice implies some hierarchy of oppression. So does confronting ageism require us to support every struggle for equal rights? So moving beyond just ageism to think about other forms of prejudice and oppression. I'm not sure who would like to come in first on that.
I'm happy to.
Please do then, go ahead.
I think that what we know from intersectionality and the studies of intersectionality is that it's when you work with them all together that you really see progress. Because, you know, I didn't include that in my story, but along these lines, absolutely, intersectionality is essential in what you experience as ageism throughout that life course. And it is throughout that life course. So as we're learning about other identities, we need to be learning as part of that about our age identity. But it absolutely, to my mind, has to be looked at together. Mm. I think quite often what happens is that when people are older and the discrimination is described, it's often the other, not the age, but the other identity factor that sort of headlines. So older women, it's the women bit we hear about more than the older bit. We're not looking for older men to be their allies, we're looking for younger women to be their allies, really, and how it's framed. And yet when it's children, it's usually their childrenness, which is, I think, at the forefront of the bit that's the transgression that's being described. So I think there's some interesting ways in which intersectionality is discussed at different parts of that story.
I'll have a go.
Tara, yeah, please.
I think you do have to recognize other struggles, definitely. I think when it comes to ageism, also when you start putting, it is a bigger feminist issue than it is a male issue. I think when you then layer on ethnicity, it's non-white people who suffer more than white people. So I think there is an intersectionality. I think it's important to learn from other people, their struggles, and how we can adopt this struggle. So yeah, I do think it's important that all of them, you really do have to recognize them. You don't necessarily have to participate in them, but it does mean that you do have to recognize them, because it is about oppression, which is just generally not acceptable.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to ask Louise whether that featured in the language work and the descriptions, how you would respond in terms of the work that you've just recently published with the Centre for Aging Better.
Yeah, and you know, building on what Tara and Hannah have said as well, certainly for women, and if we're talking about language, you see, you know, these phrases which are particularly aimed at women, older women, and activity like anti-aging. So ageist activity in advertising, like anti-aging, and in culture in general, where certainly there's this huge crossover between sexism and ageism that it is hard to separate out. I mean, Ashton Applewhite is such a guru in this field. It's a really great question. There's a huge Venn diagram with ageism and the other isms, and you absolutely see disadvantage multiplied as soon as you have more than one protected characteristic. And COVID has shone a huge light on that, with particularly older Black people, older BME people suffering the most. You know, you also have to overlay poverty and geographical variation on that in terms of who's going to miss out on a good later life the most. So there is a lot to tackle, and it is hard to separate out. You know, when you start looking at recruitment, as Tara was talking about, in terms of people wanting to work when they're over 50, if you're a woman and you're BME and you're older, then there are multiple ways in which it's harder to get into the labour market. So yeah, you have to, as the others have said, look at intersectionality as well.
Well, I'll just follow that up with another question that's come in, and it's come from, you know, a different perspective from Sophia Kleanthaus, who says that as a late 20s disabled woman, I've found that ageism also impacts me. For example, being told that I'm not old enough to be sick or disabled, so it works the other way too. And her question then is, how can civil society tackle the problems with ageism and ableism that increases disability discrimination? So really it's picking up on intersectionality, but to ask that question about the role of civil society in responding to the intersections of age and disability. I don't know who would like to, you know, pick up on that first.
I think, well, I can. I think that is another intersection, which I think is important. As I just briefly mentioned, you can have ageism at any age. And I think we have to get away from what, I mean, a lot of people just think it's about older people. It's not. It is about prejudice. So a lot of people think they're younger, they don't know anything, therefore they can't be given jobs that they're given. So I mean, it works against it that way. I think it works. I think ableism probably should, yes, it needs to be recognized as well. But I suppose my question back to the questioner is it her disability that is holding her back, or a perception of her age itself? Because I know in certain industries, if you're not, you know, you're not coming up into your mid-30s, they don't think you know anything. So I think it's difficult. I don't know if that was a very good answer, but
all answers are good answers. I don't know what, Louise, yeah.
Yeah, Tom, I think there are structural factors in society that disadvantage people really profoundly of all ages when you have a disability. So if you take accessible housing, for example, which we've been campaigning on, and lots of people on this call will know about, our current housing stock is deeply inaccessible. It's very hard for people to get in, and that goes for older people with mobility issues, younger people who've got a disability, and actually families who've got, you know, pushchairs and buggies, and, you know, people carrying heavy luggage, or if you want to be visited by somebody in a wheelchair. And certainly there is an opportunity now for all new housing to be built to higher levels of accessibility as a minimum. So there are some factors, whatever your age in society, where if you've got a disability, you're at significant disadvantage, and that absolutely needs to be dealt with.
Okay. Well, I think what I might do is come back to one of my sort of preparatory questions, really, and it touches on Tara's approach, and it's about reframing. And there's a lot of interest in you know, how organizations, how we can approach topics from a different perspective, so that we can think about, you know, reframing a topic so that the solutions are much more palatable, and that we can build coalitions around resolving these issues. So we've seen that in the UK in terms of discourse around poverty, for example, and presenting, you know, reducing poverty in a way that doesn't stigmatize people who are living on low incomes. And I'm just wondering, you know, how we really go about reframing age in a way that presents the opportunities associated with aging in later life. So it picks up on everything that you've each of you said in some way, but I'm just wondering how we actually do that. I don't know whether, you know, well, Louise, you make a start and then.
Because yeah, and it's a fascinating area, and obviously we've been working with Equally Ours and Comrades. And Equally Ours is an agency that specialises in reframing, and we've also had long and really interesting discussions with the Frameworks Institute in the States, who kind of pioneered the approach. And effectively, the process is to get a really deep understanding of the current frames that are used and which values they speak to in people. So whether or not they speak to values of kind of openness and mutual support, or whether the kind of words and phrases incite an idea of selfishness or control. And actually, you have to start trying to deconstruct language and create new language that resonates with people, that speaks to values which are much more about support and openness and socially progressive ideas. And that can include metaphors that speak to people, that makes them feel more positive about aging in this case. So we are on that journey, and I know Joseph Rowntree Foundation have been doing, as you said, loads of work on trying to think about metaphors, like unlocking people from poverty is one that they frequently use, which people respond to really positively, because suddenly framing poverty as a prison is a frame that makes people angry and they think that's unfair. So we're on that journey of trying to change that frame and recreate that language to generate a really much more positive response about aging.
And I was going to, ask Hannah whether, because you were talking about the journey through life and how, how a reframing of age then creates opportunities to move away from that linear institutionalized life course into the sort of the tree rings and looking at growth and potential.
I think that what we have to really accept is that we learn to age, and there's nowhere that we are supported to make sense of our changing age identity. What's rumbling around in the unconscious is this negative story, and then of course it keeps being perpetuated because we're not we don't even know it's there. So I think what I think we need really is strategic leadership, and not in a reframe of being old, but of a reframe of aging. And I don't mean aging from the 50 plus, I mean aging from the moment you're born. And I think if we don't have opportunities in our lives to make sense of that, like I said about my niece not really knowing what it's going to be like for her voice to change, I think we're going to struggle to get away from this story. So what I would love to see is a kind of coalition of people wanting a vision across the life course and having and sort of embedding policies and practice which help people explore their age identity as it changes from really early, and to have those conversations with people at different life stages. I find that a lot of intergenerational practice, though very brilliant, at building individual, really warm and nourishing relationships, they very rarely explore what age identity is and the differences. It's not an active part of the conversation. And what very little evidence there is says it doesn't change my internalized ageism if I get involved in an intergenerational project as a child. It doesn't. It makes me feel warm about this person I've met, but it doesn't change this line story. And so we don't have a toolkit of things that help us to, like Tara said, bring it from the unconscious into at least the conscious, that we're working this into ourselves. And then, of course, with each other.
Yeah, and I think one of my concerns on the intergenerational programs is just what you said there about the way in which they may reinforce the age stereotypes and perpetuate those stereotypes, if not done really in a thoughtful way. Tara, I'm going to give you the chance to sort of say a few sentences as well.
Thank you. I don't think it is any one person or any one area's responsibility to change it. I think it's all of our responsibility to change it. I think academics need to step up, probably. I don't know who actually framed the life course, the way it's described at the moment, but that really does need work. And I think that will be academics coming to that and then working with creative industries, because creative industries are never at the table when we talk about these things. They're in a different room and they want to stay in that room because it's comfortable for them. But I'm now talking to people, and it's interesting what's happening in creative industries, because people are growing up in them, they want to keep working, and they're now being thrown out, and they're getting very, very angry. So I think things like that will help them change. I think working with business will help change. It's going to happen on a small basis, but I think some of these companies, with great power comes great responsibility, and they do influence people. And they need to be worked on. I think broadcasters and producers have a great responsibility, not just to reinforce the negative trope, which I think Louise was talking about, but to create new visions of age and create new discussions about age, because that's what people respond to. So I don't think it's anyone, but I think it's everyone. And I think we also have to use our own power. I think we have to push back. And we have to do the things I said. I mean, do not participate in negative language and call someone out when they're being ageist, and see how it goes.
That's brilliant. I'm just receiving multiple messages here. So what I'm wanting to do is just to start to bring the session to a close now. And there's some questions that came in that we haven't had the opportunity to address. But I'd like to thank each of our panel members for keeping so well to time, and also for responding so passionately around the topic and the questions that have been asked. I think this is obviously a really major issue. It's been a feature of my professional life since I started out in gerontology in the 1990s, that ageism and age discrimination was always there as a major concern. I think what's happened over the course of 2020 in particular is that our experience this year has really cast ageism in a new light. But I think that has also opened up the opportunity to really think about how we address ageism in a much more structural way, in a way that has the potential to have much longer traction, is to make ageism as unacceptable as other forms of prejudice and discrimination. And I think that's one of the key opportunities that has emerged throughout what has been, a pretty awful year. But I think the other message that comes through each of the presentations is something that, we overlook at our peril, and that is the need, firstly, to engage across generations. Is that we shouldn't make ageism, addressing ageism, a campaign that only engages with older people. That any meaningful response to the sources of prejudice and discrimination that exist within our society based around age need to engage the different age groups, but they also need to engage different sectors of society. And that is where the discussion, I think, ended, was that we can't do this without the private sector in its multifaceted nature. We clearly can't do this without the public sector, and this is where the role of universities and higher education is really part of the solution, as well as having historically been part of the problem. But we need to engage also third sector and also citizens. And that comes right down to individuals who need to be aware and to think about choice of words, the ways in which their own behaviours perpetuate negative stereotypes, negative age-related identities. So if any of those sectors are missing, we're going to fail in terms of what we want to achieve in relation to addressing ageism. So on that note, we are going to come to an end, except I have a message here about, there's a virtual event that ILC is hosting on the 28th of January 2021, which explores the overlap between ageism and ableism in the workplace, providing insights for occupational health and training. So you can access that event through the ILC's website. But in the meantime, I'd like to thank everybody for listening in. We're going into a 15-minute break before returning for the final sessions of the afternoon's conference. So thanks very much for listening.